is this regulative ideal that I mentioned at the beginning, that attention ought to be directed to what's of significance. And a lot of these, what's happening online is that we're systematically led away from that ideal. And I think we need to like figure out how this importance of autonomy with regard to attention, and how this importance for like having our attention respond to significance, how to respect that.
I'm very excited to be joined today by Sebastian Watzl. Sebastian is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oslo. He's the author of Structuring Mind, The Nature of Attention, How It Shapes Consciousness, and I would say one of the foremost thinkers on attention in the world today. So a massive welcome to Sebastian. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And I wonder, how did you get interested in attention in the first place? What was it that kind of drew you to the topic?
My first interest in attention was from studying consciousness, actually. So as a philosophy graduate student, I studied consciousness. And I wanted to know some more things about how we know about our own conscious states. And then I wanted to know also about how we use our conscious experience to learn about the world. And I discovered at that point that attention seems to be crucial for both of these things. By focusing attention on our own minds, we can learn about our own conscious experiences, and by focusing attention on the world, we can learn about the world. And then I discovered that wasn't really something that philosophers had written a lot about, and I discovered that there's this huge trove of research in psychology, in the neurosciences about it. And so I started digging into that, discovered that in the history of philosophy, there was actually discussion about attention in the early modern period, and in, for example, the Buddhist tradition or other East Asian traditions. And so I discovered that there's this whole field lying there wide open, and I started working on it.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that it is so underdeveloped, because that was something I noticed as well when I was looking at the ethics of attention. I think your paper was the only one that I could find, really, and it seems to be such a key topic almost. I wondered if you could go into, for people, how attention works, your priority theory, a priority structure view, and how that kind of how you think about attention.
Well, the way I'm thinking about attention is that attention is what's organizing your mind. So stuff comes into your mind through the senses primarily, and there's some things that are stored in memory. And attention takes what's activated in your mind and organizes that, sort of stacks it up by the priority it has for you. So from the top priority down to the things that are sort of deprioritized and kind of put into the background. And it uses that organization then for action. So what's the top priority is going to be playing a bigger role for your actions, for what are you going to form beliefs about, what are you going to ask questions about. And so that activation of our current mental states that attention creates in terms of its priority for you is going to be used in various ways by us. And that prioritization, that's another part, like the second part of my book was about that, has a big effect or a sort of upshot in how we experience the world. Our experience, our consciousness, is what it's like, what it feels like to us. Their attention seems also important. So when, for example, suppose you're listening to a piece of music. There's a band playing, there's a guitar, there's the drums, there's some pianist. Now, when you can shift your attention in listening from one instrument to the other, from the melody to the rhythm, and some nuances in say how a particular instrument is playing, and doing that clearly changes your experience. Your whole musical experience is going to be different. So you prioritize these different parts of the musical piece, one instrument, another instrument, the melody, the rhythm, and that changes your experience, and roughly changes it, I think, by what is in the center of your experience and what is in the periphery. And so that prioritization that I'm speaking about also has an upshot in how we experience the world. And it's like our perspective on the world largely is what is central, what is pushed into the background. So that's also central to my way of thinking about attention, that notion, that way of prioritizing for action, what philosophers sometimes call sort of the function of attention, sort of its role in our cognitive architecture, that's connected with the way attention shows up from the first person point of view, how it is like for us.
Yeah, and that seems almost quite, I don't know what you think of like the spotlight model of attention, because that seems quite different to that type of way of thinking about it. I think it's so fascinating, the idea of attention organizing the mind. It was something, I don't know if you're familiar with John Vervaeke and his work on relevance realization. He does a lot of stuff on attention. I had him on the podcast previously, but he was talking about that, how attention is almost optimizing. If you're looking at something, you're optimizing seeing it, or when you're listening, you're optimizing hearing a particular thing. It's like zeroing in this complex environment with so much different stuff. Is this a kind of new model of attention? Do you think is there a conflict there maybe a little bit, or is it just underdeveloped? I don't know.
I think there are connections here to both some things in the history of philosophy and in psychology. So it just like looks at the history of philosophy. I think some of that is actually, you find in some of the early sort of phenomenologists and Gestalt psychologists. So you mentioned, for example, relevance. So as a sort of one of the founders of sort of the phenomenological tradition of sociology, Alfred Schütz, he writes about relevance and attention organizing the mind. And he was closely in correspondence with a philosopher called Aaron Gurvitch, writing around the mid-20th century, who wrote about the field of consciousness and attention and how it structures that. So I'm kind of influenced by that. So it's not new. And those people were reacting against the model where the only role for attention was to select particular items that are already pre-presented in the field of consciousness. And so the spotlight model is something that react against, because they think there's much more to attention than just like picking particular items that are already presented in the field.
Stuff. Okay.
And in psychology, I think there's also connections to, you can think the spotlight model, attention just, there's like perceptual representations, and then attention shines a spotlight on them and highlights some of them and makes those easier, for example, to access for us in our memory formation, in our belief formation, and while we process information. On the way I'm thinking about it, that's partly what attention does, but it also, for example, changes the way our representations, changes our representations in perception itself. It makes, for example, changes to how much detail is represented in perception. It changes how accurate the perception is, and that's all in the service of prioritization. So there's much more than the spotlight.
And prioritization as well. I was reading today actually your paper on self-control and attention. And it was so fascinating to see like that attention as kind of the foundation of agency, because obviously a lot of the free will debate seems to hinge on choice and things like that, and this kind of the freedom of the will. But this type of attentional choice of preferencing one thing over another, or making salient, you find one thing salient and then reprioritizing it. You give the example of somebody that finds a cookie very salient, but doesn't want to eat the cookie, and so has to kind of reprioritize on a run. How central is attention to agency and to self-control? I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, because I've never really heard it anywhere else.
Well, there are. I think it's very central. I think there are other people writing about it. There's a philosopher called Wayne Wu who thinks that attention is central to action. So he thinks attention just is selecting for action. And so, on his view, attention is involved in all action, because every action involves a selection problem, or a problem for choosing one out of many possible behavioral paths in the ways we could act. So I think that attention is central in agency, but I think that there could be some sort of fairly automatic forms of action where attention is not involved. Now, like, you mentioned that work of mine on self-control. I do think there's this very interesting, so the way there's this very interesting idea that I think hasn't really been developed, that freedom of attention is kind of necessary for all kinds of freedom. So James Williams writes about that in his work on attention and the internet and kind of and I think that question is kind of what I'm addressing in that self-control paper, or beginning to address. I'm like working now more about it with some students, like how exactly is attention involved in freedom of action? And the way I'm thinking it's involved is that attention is like the simplest way. So imagine, let's start with this. Let's think about a very simple creature, like simpler than an insect, where there's something happening in the environment, and that thing just triggers a behavioral response kind of automatically. So that would be a creature that doesn't have freedom. So you have something happening in the environment, that thing is registered, but that registration is immediately transferred into a certain response. So you have there's some food in the environment, the creature registers that food and reacts to it. There's a predator, it registers a predator and reacts to it. So attention gives you freedom because so suppose you have a predator and some food. Now, you want to register both of them, but depending on your current needs, if you're very hungry, you want to prioritize the food. If you are, if there's a very dangerous predator, you want to run away, even if, you might suffer a little bit of hunger. And so attention helps you to prioritize among these things while keeping both of these pieces of information alive. And so I think that gives attention this crucial role in free action. It helps you to integrate your motivations, what you currently want and need, with what's going on in the environment, what information you have of what's happening in the world. And it does so in this flexible way. And so attention gives you that flexible interface to the world. And I think that we see that in the self-control. Now think about the cookies. In the case of the cookies, you perceive some cookies, but you have decided that actually you don't want to eat cookies today because you want to go run and be fit and so on. Now I think you can kind of enact your decision to go on a run and not eat the cookies by shifting the focus on the cookies. You're shifting the focus away from the cookies, and thereby you're gonna be enabled to resist that immediate impulse to eat them. So it's like the praise of the predators and the food, but in a more sophisticated kind of way.
It seems to connect to the consciousness thing as well, that it's almost like to have freedom in that sense, consciousness is a precondition of it to what we define as freedom. And is that attention coming into that question as well, that you almost have to have the capacity to switch between objects of attention to be classified as free? If you're just responding, I suppose you're not, you don't have what we describe as freedom. So is it, Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I might.
If suppose so you can have a mechanism where an organism just registers something and prioritizes, in some sense of prioritize, among a range of stimuli. So it prioritizes the predator over food, for example. Yeah. If that's just built into the hardware of the system, then I think that organism wouldn't have any freedom. So it needs to be flexible. And then, so you need to be, you'd be able to shift the focus depending on, for example, what you want. And so, I think that this is connected to consciousness, because I think that consciousness itself is kind of involves that ability to integrate a number of different pieces of information and to sort of take a perspective on it. So I do think consciousness is connected, but I connected to that. But I also suspect that some primitive version of this prioritization can happen without consciousness. Maybe it does in insects, for example. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm kind of thinking that there's a lot of unconscious forces that kind of act on attention in terms of our, in terms of like novel stimuli, things that you pointed out, like a dangerous predator and stuff. Like we'd have these kind of evolved responses that would draw our attention to things more readily. And then sort of where the ethics comes in might be on reflecting about that. That was kind of maybe where I was trying to get to with the consciousness, is like the freedom is a precondition for responsibility. Is that where then the ethics comes in this kind of puzzle?
Partly. I mean, I do think that what makes attention sort of ethically significant is partly that it's an aspect of our agency, what we're sort of doing, what we have some level of control over. And as you mentioned, of course, not complete. That control is not complete. There's a lot of things that capture our attention, and that's also important. That passive capture, because imagine this creature who just focuses on what they want to focus on. So this is this creature who like just focuses on work. And like then there's the fire alarm, and then there's the grizzly coming out of the woods. That would be a very horrible state of affairs if you're just locked into your own desires. Or at some point, if you can imagine, there's also kind of unfreedom to this, right? You decide that you're going to work on this one thing. And like, there's all the other people who have interesting things to say about it, about what you should focus on. Just you have made a decision at one point in your life, and now you're locked into this one road forever. That would be sad. So you need an interplay, an interplay between the sort of controlling your attention, but being open to these passive forces.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't really be locked into one or the other, I suppose. And I suppose on the topic of the ethics, there was you mentioned Stoicism at one point, because I think this is something that's kind of in a lot of Stoic philosophy, is this preference for controlling attention, and that you should be paying attention to what you value, what your goals are, and where you're putting your attention. I know Epictetus says like you become what you give your attention to. There's this aspect of character and attention, that giving your attention to something is building your character, and it has that kind of habitual nature to it, that if you keep doing it, you could end up like the creature that's just mono-fixated on one thing and you're not actually adapting anymore. Do you see it connected to those philosophical traditions as well and the ethics of attention?
Yeah, I do think that the traditions in the history of philosophy that may have been most interested in attention often emphasize that character building or virtue aspect of ourselves. That because, as you say, what we attend to builds who we are over time. Attention is patterned. While it's fleeting, it's always changing. It's also patterned and leads to changes in who we are over long periods of time. So attention is kind of a crucial aspect of virtue like that. And so I agree with those traditions. What I like to emphasize, though, as well, and what some of these traditions I think don't emphasize maybe enough, is that the environment in which the individual is placed is also crucial. I think it's not enough to just be virtuous. There's an environment in which you're embedded, and if you're, and some people are lucky to be, for example, embedded in an environment that has a lot of resources for them available for good things to attend to and so on. And some people don't have that, and so we kind of miss out on certain things that we look at or see or listen to, not because we don't have the wrong character, but because our environment doesn't have the right stimuli in them, or because our social communities systematically exclude us from certain pieces of information. So I want to emphasize that aspect as well.
Yeah, definitely. There's something that stuck out to me, I suppose, about the virtue traditions and the kind of something that they seem to have in common is that attentional training. I know you mentioned Buddhism, and Stoicism seems to have that as well, that there's almost a skill to attention. But as you pointed out, if you're in an environment without that, I mean, you're going to be caught up in whatever's going on. Do you think there's an educational component to this? Because you had mentioned, I know in the self-control essay, about attentional skills and attentional skill building. Is that something you've come across in the literature, or that's going on, or is it kind of waiting to be done?
Well, no, there is some. I mean, a lot of the draw that we see currently on sort of mindfulness techniques or various meditation techniques. I mean, they're explicitly advertised as ways in which you can train your capacity for attention that will then help you to, be better at certain tasks, become a better person. And they, of course, come from lots of these meditative traditions, like, for example, Buddhism. So there's a lot of emphasis on this idea of training attention. Now, the question is, of course, what do we actually train attention for? One is that we're going to train attention to be able to just focus very hard for a long period of time and get a lot of work done. I think that's one way in which some, that kind of training for attention is very useful if you're thinking about how to train an investment banker. But if you want to train a person who, for example, is a good listener and who is able to respond to social cues in the environment, if things come up, if your baby cries, you're going to hear it, that might not be the best attention. So I think when one talks about training, it's important to think about what exactly do we want from a good capacity of attention. Do we just want this kind of ability to focus, or do we really want a more sort of socially sensitive type of attention? And a lot of these meditative traditions actually were, I think, very sensitive to this. They didn't want to just train someone to focus on, say, an image, or they wanted someone whose attention is flexible and responds also to environmental and social cues. And I think in some of the discussion contemporary on sort of training attention, I see that aspect a little bit missing.
Really, that's very interesting. So it's more kind of, it was kind of reminding me there in terms of like finding the right things salient and the right things relevant. If you're working really hard and your partner comes in and is very upset or something, you shouldn't just, you got to be able to switch between them, and kind of, there's a fluidity to it between like tight and expanded, or it can't be too tight or too loose in a sense. It requires the full range of attention. But I wonder, does it connect kind of to I'm thinking about the virtue of Sopherson, of right desire, in a sense. Is there virtues of attention that you see that are related to this? Because I know you said it kind of connects to the virtue traditions, but like, is wise attention, courageous attention, temperate attention? Do you think there's a connection between that?
I think so. I mean, there may be, attention is probably involved, particular patterns of attention in any of these virtues that you mentioned. And I'm currently kind of talking to some PhD students, or one in particular, who are interested in the ancient tradition and how they talked about attention. And I think there's more and more sort of work on how important it was for how Aristotle and so on talked about virtues, how attention may have been neglected in how we have interpreted them. I don't know very much about that, but I know that people are doing that currently.
Okay.
What I'm sort of interested in is, I'm kind of liking the idea that that attention is kind of guided by attention should be responsive to what's of significance, and that provides us a kind of standard for attention across these various virtues. So they can be things can be significant in a number of different ways. So they can be epistemically significant. They help us to get knowledge about the world. They can be of personal significance, and some can be significant partly only because you care about it. But then they can be morally significant in a way that doesn't just depend on whether you care about it. Some things are significant even if you don't care about it. And I hope to be able to carve out a notion of significance where that can operate as a kind of a regulative ideal for attention, that across different domains, attention should be responsive to what's of significance. And I hope I can make it work, but ask me in 2 years or so whether I've succeeded.
That like to give attention to what matters most or what is most significant seems like the perfect kind of ideal. And I guess that segues into the situation of the attention economy and how we have an entire industry that's designed to capture attention. So there's a lot of pressure on people's attention now to not taken away from what might be significant to them to other people's aims, maybe the aims of industry, the aims of marketing, whatever it is. There's a lot of competition for attention. And I know you're doing a bit of work on it. I wonder what your thoughts on the attention economy are and how it relates to this significance problem.
So the attention economy, I first want to say a little bit about what we should mean by that. I think it can mean a number of different things. One thing it can mean is that our sort of decision making is dependent on what we focus attention on, and that can be and that environment in which we make those decisions can be sort of engineered and changed by other actors. And so I think that's happening a lot online. You think about the internet. The internet is a created space. I mean, it's a human created space that people have made in some way, and it's controlled by people. I mean, private and public actors own a lot of the internet, and in that environment we're taking place. And that environment may have been structured so that it brings out the role of attention in our decision making more or less, and that can be used and manipulated for various purposes. So that's one way of understanding the attention economy, as kind of like that creation of a space in which our dependence on attention can be manipulated by others. The other thing and that's kind of like the buying and selling of attention, is that we literally sell our attention to others, and I think that's a little harder to make sense of. And I have an idea about how to do that. And that I think there's a question whether that is itself problematic, and then the question is, or whether it's sort of problematic because it's happening in a space that I've mentioned before, that's owned by private and public actors, where it leads to problematic results.
Yeah, 100%. And the kind of the issue with the former version, I mean, the other version is kind of the normal, like if you're working for somebody and they're paying you, in some sense they're paying for your attention because it's part of your ability to, solve the problems that they want you to solve. But I think the issue for the latter bit is that it's happening kind of on an unconscious level with micro-targeted advertisements, or there's a large kind of mechanism behind trying to influence people's behaviors through attention. That's manipulative, essentially, I suppose. If it's a willing contract that people enter into, I suppose that's a different sort of arrangement than just being on the internet and not really realizing that there's these actors at play in the background.
Well, okay. I do think, actually, I mean, it's good that you mentioned work. I do think that at work, part of what we do is to lend out our capacities to an employer who then has some level of control over those capacities, and we get something in return, normally a salary. And those capacities can be, if you're lucky like me, the capacity can be, you get, I need to like hold an ethics lecture or a lecture, the introduction of philosophy. Maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I want to go on a walk with my child in the forest. But I need to do that now. And so I use that. But if I'm less lucky, then maybe I have to chop up some meat in a meat factory. And then I get, then I use my capacity in this way. So, and attention is involved in all of these. I need to pay attention to the classroom. When I'm in the classroom, I need to pay attention to how to chop up the meat. Okay, so that's one thing. But I think the same thing is actually also happening on the internet. So I think you said because here I'm also lending some control over my capacities out to various companies, like for example Google and Facebook. They're like Meta is like they're big on that model because the reason I mean, you know, I can pay some company for email, you know, 5-10 euros a month and get email, or I can get Gmail, you know, and well, am I getting Gmail for free? No, I mean, you know, that would be, it's not a charity organization. They're getting some help from me. And what do they get? Is they get some control over what I'm paying attention to. Especially in this case through Google search. They can direct what results I'm looking at. And it's because Google lends that out in turn to advertisement companies. So I'm giving up some control over my attention in return for free email, search, and so on and so forth, access to friends on social media, and all these things. But I'm giving up control over my attention. So I think that is that is like work in my view. And this is a paper I'm doing together with my colleague Catherine Brown. It's like work. We are giving up control over some of our capacities in order for services. So I think we are kind of, in a certain way, I think we're doing the same thing that we do at work all the time when we're on the internet. The internet is a big space where we just give up control over attention in return for something that we want or need, like access to friends, communication resources, search, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There is a trade-off. I mean, that's kind of the whole zero price model, isn't it? That it's free, but you get things, but in exchange, your data is being sold to advertisers. Or there's kind of, that's the business model. But the incentives of that business model as regarding attention are what I find. I don't know if you've heard Jaron Lanier. He's like the father of virtual reality. He writes a lot about social media. And he talks about how that the business model is really about addiction. It's not about attention. It's about capturing as much attention as possible, and that actually leads to certain business practices that are not good for the consumer, their well-being, or for their, you know, mental health, or even using these social dynamics or gamification and things that lean a little bit more pressure on people to use these things than maybe they would want to. I'm trying to think of a comparison to work, but
well, it's happening all the time at work. I mean, it's I think it is important to realize that this kind of what's happening online is that there's some powerful companies that have you know, a lot of resources available, and those are creating structures in which we give out. I mean, they're exploitative in the sense, I think, probably because we're giving out more than you know would be fair to get email and so on, because we are in a poor negotiating position with regard to these companies. They control the internet, right? And there's like lots of interest, political or private interests, like invested on this, and so they're going to create structures that, as you say, like can be addictive, and they're going to use this to get as much out of us as they can. And there's going to be political. There's a lot of knowledge about how these structures are used for political manipulation, then and so on. Now, at work, I think we need to not forget that that's also happening at work. It's like people like me, they face a problem of like unfreedom only online. If you're working in this meat factory, and if you are struggling with your job, and if you're working, I mean, if you're reading about like people who work on Mechanical Turk that around the Amazon, they're like doing tasks on their computer. I mean, they're not like looking at advertisement, or they're doing micro tasks on the computer. They're kind of in an extremely oppressive work environment. And I think so I think we just seeing that expanding to more aspects of life. So where a lot of the things that have been regulated in the labor market through, for example, unions and so on, in at least some parts of the world, like the workday is so and so long, you can't take more than this, you don't have a right to control when you go into the bathroom and so on. That has been taken away in this new part where like now we're lending our capacities and there's no regulation. There's nothing. It's like the Wild West. It's like the 19th century, the kind of stuff that, you know, Marx was writing about in the big factories in England. It's a bit like that, happening online because we haven't figured out how to regulate that market. We haven't, and people are like at the mercy of like these extremely powerful companies.
Yeah, and it's having a massive effect on culture and on individuals. I mean, the problems of polarization and misinformation, a lot of stuff I've been working on at the moment. But I guess to bring it to attention again, do you think that the changing of priorities, kind of interested in the pattern of attention or how this, because something that James Williams said in that in his thesis, The Freedom and Persuasion in the Attention Economy, was that the functioning of attention could act as a regulatory framework for persuasive technologies, like the proper functioning of attention, that if that was respected, so maybe people have a right to prioritize the things that they want to prioritize to some extent.
Yeah,
but how would you measure it? I don't know. I wonder what
I
you think.
agree that there's I think a powerful I think there's a powerful analogy that I'm thinking a lot about, that people, in the Enlightenment period, like discovered the importance of personal autonomy, and personal autonomy already at that point meant partly the freedom of thought. So having a freedom over your own mind. And attention is like the freedom over our own attention, being autonomous with regard to our attention, is like that. That's important part of that. I have a colleague that in Finland, Kaisa Kärki, who is like writing about, for example, autonomy and attention. I think it's super important to find that out. I mean, and then there's this regulative ideal that I mentioned at the beginning, that attention ought to be directed to what's of significance. And a lot of these, what's happening online is that we're systematically led away from that ideal. And I think we need to like figure out how this importance of autonomy with regard to attention, and how this importance for like having our attention respond to significance, how to respect that. And the problem for how to do that right, I think, is that it seems, of course, it's given that we live in a world of other people, it cannot be quite right that what should happen is that we have no one has the right to ever talk to us. That seems wrong. And other people have a right to somehow try to persuade us. But I think just like but we think we need to find a way in which maybe when that other side isn't a single person, but like this international powerful company, there should be some limits, or like or a powerful figure. Also states. I mean, we can see that also in states. I think I do think that this idea that our mind should be free and respond to the world in an appropriate way is linked to attention, and we need to find out how to respect that better than we currently do.
That seems like the most crucial thing, really, and that we haven't at the moment kind of figured out what to do with these technologies that can actually protect that freedom of attention. It's so interesting, the significance as well, the idea of being able to give attention to what's significant or what's relevant, because so much of the social media is designed towards pushing you towards things that are just going to get you caught up, essentially stickiness, things that are going to have you on there for a long time. And that almost seems like the antithesis of being able to give attention to significance. Like, it would have to limit your use almost of the technology, because to give all the time to, like, there's other things that are significant, like your family, your friends, your relationships, your pursuits, your exercise. It would almost have to have limits upon how much you can use of the internet, do you think? Or is that too
maybe.
much?
I kind of like, I'm one of these people, I actually am, some people are all about the technology and how that's bad. I'm actually not, I think that's why I kind of said originally that I think the internet is a big space that's made by humans. And I think we should think of that space in the same way as we think about other parts of our the space we live in.
Yeah.
It's we connect to each other through the internet. I mean, we are talking on the internet right now. It can be extremely valuable. People find people that are have interesting things to say, are similar to them online. There's like great opportunities. But then there is this problem, I think, like the technology on the internet, a lot of this space is is owned, and in a way that like think about the offline world. If you want to meet your friends, you're going to drive on a road. There's no one who can just block the road and say, "Oh, actually, today we'll like
direct you to one particular kind of place."
Or like say, "Oh, before you get to your friends, you need to like do this task or look at some advertisement." Online, that's how it is. Like someone controls this, and like a person, like people use Twitter to connect to their friends, to find out information about important topics, and it's literally we're doing this in the living room of a powerful person. I mean, that's you just imagine that's crazy. It's like that's what's crazy about it. It's not the technology. It's that's crazy is that we're doing these tasks that are super important for us in the privately owned space of a person who can just buy a big portion of the world. And so that's, I think, in my view, it's less that specific technology is like what's happening on the technology.
Yeah. I know, I completely agree. I think it's crazy because they've become kind of the public space or the forums for communication and for sharing ideas a lot of the time. But then the design of the platforms and the business incentives kind of influence the structures. It's like the Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, that there's kind of, I'd heard it compared to the aqueducts in Rome, that like it's this amazing technology that brings water to everybody, but there might be lead in it that's driving people crazy, and there's something kind of we have to contend with. But on the business note, I wonder if the government alternative, like if the government was in charge of it, would that not be also an issue? I suppose I'm thinking of China and the way they're kind of handling it is like there's almost no good democratic solution at this point, where it's like the business one's not working, the government one is a bit fishy based on what we've seen in other countries. So like, does there need to be like a third party kind of thing? I don't. Yeah. I
mean, I think there's a bunch of. I mean, you're completely right that to say, the way to solve these problems is to just give all the authority to the government. We see that in Russia. We see that in China. That's not going to be.
It's not working.
Better.
No.
Then there's like the sort of completely free market model. I mean. In Europe, in the Scandinavian countries especially, we do have this old idea that I think is still a good idea, social democracy, sort of like that is market, but regulated through democratically elected governments. And I think we need to think about how to make the internet more democratic. This involves technology, involves new forms of governance. And part of the problem, of course, is that the internet is this big international thing. So, we're talking on platforms that are situated in one country and therefore regulated by the laws of that country. And the other countries, like, it's not like Norway could just decide that the internet in Norway is going to work like this. I do think that what one I think can do is what's also happening in some other parts, that one try, like a country like Norway could try out some things in a small scale way that then could be serve as role models for other countries, for example.
I'd heard Ireland is, Francis Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, had said that Ireland should really step up and do it, which is where I'm from and where I'm based. There's a big, because a lot of the companies are based there as well. I mean, Meta have headquarters in Dublin and other ones that there is an opportunity there to expand that conversation. But it's difficult again, when it's international and when there's so much kind of influence. I mean, billions of people use these services, and it's a very interesting circumstance. But I think it really comes down to this attention. That's really what I think is the.
Well, it does. I mean, I agree. I mean, when you think, I mean, here's another way of thinking about that. It's like in the world, in the offline world, the distance between you and I can be measured in kilometers. In the online world, you think about like what is keeping you from certain things is that you're not paying attention to them. What's easy to get to is like what is easy to pay attention to. Attention is kind of like, in a certain way, the measure by which we connect to each other. And I think the limits of our attention are the limits of what our online world. And so that's why I think the discussion it is also in part about attention, because that's what limits or expands our personal and collective kind of viewpoint online.
Yeah, that is such an interesting way of looking at it. I had never really thought about like that in that kind of way, and that the limits are, that there's too much information all the time. That was Herbert Simon's kind of observation about that the information economy actually became an attention economy, because what information consumes is attention. So there's a plethora of information and there's a scarcity of attention. I think we're using a lot of these algorithms, the recommendation algorithms, to try and solve that problem, that there's just too much information to get people the information that's relevant to them or that they would like to see. But I wonder about the principles of those systems, because it seems to come down to significance again, or relevance. Like what should be relevant? Because who could say, what should be the metric for what we find significant or relevant?
Yeah. I mean, this is just run this this is a thought that I've had, and I don't know, run this idea by you. I think one part of the problem is that, at least on some spaces, some social media, but also I think that's partly that's also true. I mean, social media like Facebook, WhatsApp, and so on, Instagram, I think that's clear, is that the problem is that these are really used for many different purposes. And significance in one dimension and significance in a different dimension, they can diverge. So suppose you're going to the library to find information, right? I mean, there you find information, and it's clearly optimized for finding information. I mean, there's a whole system that librarians have devised to organize information. Why is Facebook not looking like that library? Or why is Instagram not looking like that library? Well, here's why. Because it'd be really boring. It would be. I mean, it's one reason, right? And people wouldn't want to spend time on it. But that may be, maybe there's a financial interest by these companies. But also, these things are also places where we hang out with our friends, where it's like, they function also like a pub. They function like a family dinner table, where we just want to hang out and make connections, make personal bonds with people. And it's doing this, and that's a different kind of significance, right? I mean, you just want to like hang out with your buddies and build personal connections and so on. And that, and the information search for like, stuff about vaccines and so on is happening in the same place. And it's completely unclear how to optimize for these two things at once. It's like turning something into a library, turning it into a pub. There are going to be very different demands on how that space is going to look like. And if you try to do both, you're going to do both of them really badly. So, how do we solve this online? I don't know. I mean, if you're just going to build a library type space, well, the problem is that no one's going to use it. Because people also don't go to the library, the real libraries. So there's a problem. I don't know the solution to it, but the problem is that the internet does so many different things, and significance, and it's true, significance guides us online, guides our attention, but significance can come in these varieties. And how to, even if no bad actors are present in this, and there are a lot of bad actors present, I think it's hard to optimize in all these dimensions at the same time.
Yeah, so difficult. I was thinking about like the news feed when they tried to have the chronological news feed on Facebook and Instagram, and it's just like there's so much being uploaded. It's just every bit of nonsense that somebody throws up on the internet is just going to appear one after another, and nobody will use it. But then the personalization can trap you in a bubble where you're just seeing essentially, like, you know, if you're into anti-vaccine stuff, you're going to see just more and more and more anti-vaccine stuff, and you might never see an alternative opinion because of the nature of the personalization. I wonder if you could have a metacognitive, almost like a step back, where you have people can interact with the recommendation algorithm, so they can choose what the significance should be. So you have, okay, I want more social stuff. Okay, I want more informational stuff. Like, you could have some sort of interface where you can prioritize what, you know, it is that you're looking for on the space. But
I think that seems to me a good idea, to create something like, I mean, that in fact, what you do create is then kind of turn this for some period of time into the pub or the library, where you can say, now, I mean, like, I'm here on now, not to hang out with my friends, but to find out information about the vaccines. I'm turning on the info button, and then I go to the library, as it were. I think something like that it can work. I mean, I do think also there's one big success story on the internet that shows how this can be done. That's Wikipedia. I mean, it's an amazing model we have created a better encyclopedia that probably has ever existed through this completely sort of crowdsourced in this completely crowdsourced kind of way with some oversight, but fairly minimal, and it seems to work really well. I think one can also think about how to make other parts of the internet more like that, and what we can learn from that, what we might not be able to learn from it.
Yeah, and it seems the incentives on Wikipedia have attracted a very different kind of audience. People that are putting stuff on it because they're interested in things and they want to build this kind of knowledge base, and then people that are consuming it for whatever purposes. There's almost more of an ideal there, in a sense, of information and knowledge, rather than maybe Instagram, which might be popularity or social status, or it seems to really matter what the ideal of the platform is in terms of how it functions.
And maybe one can change some other parts of the online world to resemble that a little bit more. I mean, there are limits, because that you know, one reason Wikipedia works is that there are clear rules about what kind of information belongs there, and it's pretty clear. You know, like, it's only supposedly objective facts, so that can be kind of an objective ideal, but about a sort of regulative ideal there, that it's supposed to be objective, and so. In a lots of other discussions, there isn't anything that's so very objective, and I think and sometimes update every day, like the news is changing and so on. So it's harder.
It's a very interesting point there as well about the objective kind of language and objective facts, because one of the problems that I keep seeing coming up in the literature on social media is that optimizing for attention seems to optimize for emotional language or for moral language. That seems to be something that the type of content that people post is oftentimes breaking taboos, or it's kind of things that would be emotionally charged because that gets more attention, essentially, like anger, fear, seems to get more click-throughs. So that kind of, that aspect of attention maybe is also what's driving it. So you could have it then maybe if you were to limit the ability to do that, but then again, would that limit honest expression or things that are important that people are saying?
I mean, it's true that there are these. I mean, it's well known from the research on attention. Emotionally charged stimuli are going to attract attention. So if you want to keep people on social media, that emotional stimuli are going to work, and it's going to also engage them, and so they're gonna. So there's lots of stuff there that has to do with the emotions. But I mean, I do think that unfortunately changing the internet by itself is not the internet is not separate from the rest of the world. These people who use the emotions to capture attention. That's preceded internet.
That's
I'm from
sophistry,
Germany.
pretty much.
It's like it's like it was one of the big draws of the Nazi parties. They created these big emotions in people. They brought it to their home. They created a feeling of belonging.
So true.
And so that's worked before the internet. And I think you're not going to change it by regulating the internet by itself.
So true.
You need to give people, people who are desperate are going to, if you're stressed out at work, you go to the internet to get some release, and then you find and if you don't go to the internet, you go to the pub and beat someone else up. I mean, it's not like the world before the internet was this kind of nice place.
This beautiful kind of paradise where nothing ever went wrong. No, certainly, I've heard people talk about that with sophistry, kind of in the pre-Socratic time, where there was these guys would just give these persuasive speeches and bullshit people, and that's kind of what social media is, that it's this modern kind of sophistry engine. But and I wonder, I mean, is there anything about attention that you think people should be paying attention to? Is there some things that you've come across in your work that for individuals that are listening that they can use for their lives in a way that you think is important?
I mean, I do think that this idea that to just think about the question of what deserves our attention, and think about that fairly plausible idea that attention should be directed towards what's of significance. And I think one thing that people can use is to just reflect on that and think about whether what they can do with their attention to do that more, and think that their perspective on the world, the way they're going to experience the world, is partly, to big part, I think, structured through attention, and what will the way we're looking at the world will be partly determined by our patterns of attention. And so take these two ideas together. Who you are, your perspective, is your pattern of attention to a large degree, and think about, is that in line with what you yourself think is significant? And I think that will help. That can be something to think about your life, if you keep those two ideas together in mind. You're not going to solve the problems of the world because there's other factors, but if you want to start with yourself, I mean, that's a place to start, I think.
Yeah, and it sounds transformative as well, to be honest. I found the more I've looked into attention, the more I pay attention to my attention and try to, I suppose, prioritize things that I think should be prioritized versus maybe just kind of squandering my time with distractions. And I think it's quite a meaningful way to live. It definitely has some positive effects individually and for relationships and whatnot. So I think it's very sage advice for people to pay attention to that.
Well, I hope it's there's something to it, and I do think that attention is something that's easily forgotten because it's that fleeting. It's happening in the fleeting moment, unlike our beliefs are. And then there's this regulative ideal that I mentioned at the beginning, that attention ought to be directed to what's of significance. And a lot of these, what's happening online is that we're systematically led away from that ideal. And I think we need to figure out how this importance of autonomy with regard to attention, and how this importance for having our attention respond to significance, how to respect that. Desires that are sort of somewhat stable over time. Attention is changing all the time, so it's easily forgotten just how significant it is in shaping who we are. And I think taking it and centering it in how we think about our experience, our lives, can be I think a transformative experience. You're right.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. I think that's the perfect place to finish it up. I really appreciate you making time for this.
Thanks so much.